Hi, I'm G here of The Nation magazine. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Cultural Logic, where I discuss movies, books, and politics. If you like this video, please feel free to subscribe. And there'll be links below to my writing and some of the articles that we'll be referencing. Today, I want to talk about uh, Guillermo del Toro's new movie Frankenstein, which I was very excited to see for a bunch of reasons. Del Toro is obviously a major filmmaker um, with a lot of great work behind him, including the Oscar-winning Shape of Water, Pinocchio, Pan's Labyrinth, Nightmare Alley, a real master of visually resplendent horror movies. And aside from his reputation, there's the fact that this is a passion project for him, something he's been talking about for doing for at least 2 decades. The novel Frankenstein is apparently something that's meant a lot to him since he was a child, and certainly many of the themes of Frankenstein have shown up in his work earlier. And it's also a movie that's gotten a lot of praise. Rotten Tomato, for what it's worth, has it at 85% critical praise and 93% audience praise. So it's seems to be a great hit with audiences and with critics alike. My partner and I, Robin Ganev, we went to see the movie with high hopes. And as you might guess from my tone of voice, we were disappointed. The movie struck us as being mediocre and disappointing. Now, there have been a few critics who have expressed skepticism. Will Leach and Tim Gerson on their excellent Gerson and Leach podcast. Adam Naiman on in the New Republic, and so I think that there's a kind of dissenting opinion on this movie, working against the sort of critical praise that it's received. The praise has been, this is like a lavish romantic epic, with visually sweeping, the showing Del Toro's full range of visual inventiveness, which is his hallmark as a filmmaker. And on the one hand, all those things are true. On the other hand, like they seem like very insufficient. And in some ways, I mean, I think the critique of the movie is on the flip side of the celebrations of the movie. That's to say that if you don't like it, it is visually splendid to a fault in the very real sense that the visuals overpower the narrative. That this is almost a movie of like a series of great, amazing tableaus, paintings on the big screen. And I will say that even though the movie was made for Netflix and is now available on Netflix. If you get a chance to see it at the theater, you should. If you're interested in the movie at all, I mean, it really does is a movie for the big screen. And so starting from the beginning, where we have this sort of like Arctic landscape with a ship trapped in ice, like just an overpowering image, all the sort of castles, a lot of sort of European Gothic architecture and artistic design, like gargoyles and all the stuff that Del Toro has often featured in his movies. He is very much, as he says, a filmmaker shaped by the sort of Catholic visual imagery. But all this like visual splendor is in the service of a story that's not quite convincing, despite the quite the range of talent that he's brought. Now, I don't think I need to rehearse the narrative too much. It's a Frankenstein, obviously based on Mary Shelley's novel from 1818, movie story that's been much adapted, not just in film but on theater, in comic books, in television. an iconic character. And it's a story of Victor Frankenstein, a mad scientist who hubristically wants to reverse death and creates a creature who turns against the monster. So I mean that basic element um, has been like this sort of core, not just of the Frankenstein mythos, but really of like sort of modern thinking. When I write about politics, I often find the Frankenstein narrative like very easy as a metaphor, because I think that does describe the modern world. It describes like AI, it describes climate change. It describes sort of political movements, like the way in which Republicans, conservative Republicans, are nurtured white nationalism and now have found in Trump a Frankenstein monster that they can no longer control. The Frankenstein story, sort of, the modern Prometheus, hubris undone by its own folly. I mean, I think it speaks to something very elemental in the modern condition. And it is very much a sort of modern novel. I mean, I think the best sort of critical thinking about its place in the history of science fiction from writers like John Clute and Brian Aldiss located at the conjuncture of the early 19th century, where you basically had the all the forces that made up modernity being unleashed at the same time. You had sort of political revolution in the form of the French Revolution and of Napoleon, uh, where for the first time you see a kind of project of the masses to remake history in their own image, and that itself is a sort of Frankenstein story, especially if you're more politically conservative. But also at the same time, what Eric Hobsbawm calls the dual revolution: the political revolution of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution of England, and the Industrial Revolution also unleashing all sorts of changes that sort of the technological uh, uh, leap into modernity, which still shapes how we live today, which we're still grappling with. And coupled with that, a kind of artistic reaction to grapple with this. Like, what does it mean that humanity is now the master of nature? And does nature still have a place? Which comes out in Romanticism, which is in some ways the return of the repressed, or the way to deal with that. Now, Mary Shelley, was I believe 18 and 19 years old when she wrote the story. It was like famously, she and her husband Percy Shelley. And their friend Lord Byron and some other friends had a competition to see who could come up with, the most terrifying tale. This is a period at which the Gothic story was enjoying a vogue, and Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein. Byron wrote, and another friend wrote vampire stories that became sort of foundational for the vampire mythos. So Mary Shelley, I think, as that story indicates, was maybe almost uniquely well situated to write Frankenstein. She was a child of modernity. Her father, William Goodwin, Enlightenment philosopher, a strong preacher of the perfectibility of humanity, and wrote sort of novels of ideas dealing with that. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, pioneering feminist, bringing in the woman question into the issue of enlightenment. Mary Shelley herself marrying, one of the great poets of Romanticism, Percy Shelley. So all around her, like all these, and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron both being unfashionable defenders of the French Revolution, at a period where the English political elite had become completely reactionary. So all around her, Mary Shelley was seeing the all these forces of like enlightenment, political revolution, political reaction, romanticism. This was like the very stuff of her life, and it is in the book. The Frankenstein monster is modernity. It is like, what humans are now capable of once they see history as not something that's just fated, but and nature is something that is not just given to us by a creator, but something that humanity can reshape. Well, what does that lead to? And uh, Frankenstein is a very powerful exploration of this idea, and for that reason has resonance and continues to. And I think, even beyond all the adaptations that have been done, there are many um, uh, of the same themes that show up in other science fiction works. Like all the stories of intelligent robots and intelligent AI are the children of Frankenstein. If you look at a movie like Blade Runner, that is also a telling of the Frankenstein story. So, like a very powerful story, and I think that like where the movie maybe goes wrong is that Del Toro's visual sense overpowers his narrative sense, and I don't actually think maybe it's not even necessary, but I don't actually think that he's grappling with the ideas of the novel so much. He's coming at it from his own perspective. One thing that he's bringing to that is that Catholic visual imagination, which I actually don't think is in Shelley's book. I mean, I think she was a product of the Enlightenment and of sort of like English Protestantism. So it's a little bit interesting that like he foregrounds the sort of like Gothic medieval element of that. But I think that what gets lost in the story is the critique or the motivation of Victor Frankenstein. Now, in the movie version, um, I think the great weakness is the Victor Frankenstein character. Although Oscar Isaac is obviously the who plays Victor Frankenstein is obviously a very talented actor, but the motivation of Victor Frankenstein is a bit confusing. We get a few things, um, as in the novel. He has his mother dies, and he's sort of like haunted by the idea of conquering death, and so that does give you the sort of Promethean element. But I think coming out more out of Del Toro, or at least he sharpens this element of the story, is the father-son relationship. In the movie, the father of Victor Frankenstein is very much a sort of tyrant who reshapes him, and I think this is really foregrounded to a great degree, and it becomes very much movie about fathers and sons. Both Victor Frankenstein's tyrannical father, and then he himself as someone who doesn't know how to be a father, and therefore is cruel to his creation, the so-called Frankenstein monster. But then he like there's an added layer of narrative development of like a sort of a love triangle between the Victor Frankenstein, his uh, the fiance of his brother, who Elizabeth, who is played by Mia Goth, and who is also attracted to the Frankenstein monster. And so, I mean, I think what you get is, in effect, a series of complicating um, uh, motivations for Victor Frankenstein, and it's never quite clear what is driving him. And you don't get a sense from Oscar Isaac's performance of the sort of, someone who's driven by the sort of Faustian nature of this mad scientist who wants to overturn all of nature. Like it's. I found the motivation a little bit ambiguous, or like is that his motive, or is it to like outdo his father? Does he then turn against the monster because the monster is he's jealous of the monster? Uh, it's all very like sort of unclear, and I think that the Victor Frankenstein portion of the story is the weakest. I will say, like halfway through the or two-thirds of the way through the movie, we get a shift, and it becomes the story of the creature, who is like actually the standout of the movie. I mean, I think a lot of people have said this, but Jacob Elordi as a Frankenstein monster. Very strong performance, and he's a kind of like a very powerful presence. And again, there's I think one thing that the movie does is it maybe flattens the moral dimension of the relationship between the monster and Victor Frankenstein. That's to say, in this story, like the character literally says to Victor Frankenstein, "You are the monster," which is, this is the point of the story, but it is spelled out, and in the movie, it is really like all Victor Frankenstein's fault. The monster does do bad things, but maybe out of anger. And I think in the Mary Shelley novel and in other representations of Frankenstein, you get a more complex sense of the monster as having moral failings. Whereas I think this sort of flattens it. I think like this is a common theme in Del Toro's movies. The monster is actually very sympathetic. The monster endures bullying and being ostracized, and like is the subject of sympathy. And I think one thing the movie does is maybe push that too much, and then also pushes the guilt of Victor Frankenstein to such a degree that you get more of a melodrama rather than, I think, the sort of morally complex story of Victor Frankenstein hubristically creating this creature, and then the creature itself also not being morally aware, and then uh, being caught up in the guilt of being a human creature. Um, so, but added on to all this is, I think, like the visual aspects, which are on the one hand stunning, and I think are a big reason why the movie is getting so much praise. uh, Now, a lot of this is there's many different sources. Obviously, Del Toro was looking at the 1930s very famous adaptation by James Whale starring Boris Karloff, both Frankenstein and then the sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein. Those visual elements are there. He's also drawing on the work of the cartoonist and illustrator Bernie Wrightson, who did a famous sort of illustrated version of Frankenstein. And I think if you look at Wrightson's versions of the story, you will see many aspects. And recently, the comic scholar Dan Diddell, author of a biography of Robert Crumb, in the course of an interview, said something heretical, which is that Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein is not very good, and that is a heretical opinion in the sort of comics world, because like in the 1970s, he was drawing Swamp Thing and then starting to work on the Frankenstein drawings. Bernie Wrightson was a kind of like god, right? Like he was like seen as like incredible illustrator, part of this sort of school of comic book artists that were influenced by the EC horror comics, but then also fine art like the Pre-Raphaelites. Thinking of people like Michael Kaluta, and Catherine Jones. These were like major figures in the 70s and were regarded as like these great artists, and that they do. I wouldn't gainsay all their work. Much of it was powerful, but I was happy to hear Dan Nadell expressing skepticism about Wrightson's Frankenstein, because it has this problem that some of this school of art has, which is that it's very geared towards kind of like these dramatic static images that might suggest action, but like are really frozen moments in time. And there's like so much finish and refinement in the work that overpowers both the sort of any sort of like narrative value in the work, but then also like the totality of the work. Like every line is so detailed and refined that there's a curious like um, uh, lack of drama in a lot of this art. I find I've always found like it seems like you're almost supposed to admire the trickery of like all that the illustrator can do with like light and all the immense amount of detail. But are these good drawings? I never really felt that way, and I like I think that one sees this in the um, Del Toro's adaptation. Like, it has many of the same problems as Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein. Um, so I wanted to put that out there because I don't think this is something that other critics have picked up on, but I do think it's a problem. Other problems with the movie, I mean, like, it's kind of like gender problems. I mean, like, I think going out of the Catholicism, there's this kind of virgin horror dichotomy, except the virgin aspect is hugely influenced. I mean, Mia Goth's character, it doesn't make a lot of sense, is a kind of manic pixie dream girl, who rebukes Victor Frankenstein, but has a kind of operatic role to play as the noble victim. Um, yeah, the so I mean, I think especially like if you're dealing with someone like Mary Shelley, whose mother was a foundational intellectual creating well, we feminism, and who was also like, I think the whole gender question is very much in Mary Shelley's own work. I mean, in some ways, this is a story of man who hubristically not only overturns the laws of God and nature, but also the role of women. He's like a man who like tries to do what is traditionally done by women of like, birthing life and rendering women sort of obsolete. So there's a lot of like gender stuff that is implicit in the story, that one could do stuff with. And it's a bit, I mean, it's regrettable that Del Toro falls back on the very standard sort of gender norms for defining the characters. Um, there's a few good things in there. I did like Christopher Waltz's performance as a kind of um, financier who wants immortality and who is the economic source for the enterprise. And I think that uh, there's suggestions of both, and he's also an arms dealer. And the bodies that they take are from like these like horrible battlefield scenes. So I think that that is maybe where the movie tries to give a little bit of a political edge to sort of suggesting that the Frankenstein creature is coming out of both capitalism and militarism. But that's not much is done with that. I mean, like I just because so much of it is focused on Victor Frankenstein, and as I said, I think that his motivations, his whole sense of character, what is driving this man, is not very well developed in the movie. So I think that that is the problem. Um, you know, Unfortunately, largely negative review. I will say, if you're interested in Del Toro as a filmmaker, you should go see this movie, and you should go see it in a theater while you have the chance. It is kind of visually splendid, but it is a disappointing Frankenstein. So once again, if you like what you've heard, please subscribe, and we'll be back fairly soon to talk more about books and politics.